So we'll give it another few seconds.
Yeah. I can see the numbers.
Yeah, that's impressive. Yeah. So I will start in another 5 seconds. Right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are connecting from. My name is Albert Muraya, representing ISSUP Kenya, and we are delighted and honored to host this May webinar on positive psychology and the psychology of religion as applied to treatment and recovery from addiction by Reverend Dr. Sahaya Selvam of Don Bosco Youth Educational Services, Nairobi. ISSUP is an international membership organization that is focused on the development, support, and representation of a professional workforce within the field of substance use prevention, treatment, and recovery support. We address our mission by sharing the latest evidence-based ethical quality information and promoting opportunities for professional development, connection with other professionals, and doing so across borders and across professional fields nationally and internationally. We work within a network of other workforce development organizations, and we use the expertise of these organizations like ITTC, GCCC, ICU-DDR, and locally like NACADA and educational institutions, which are working at different elements within the workforce to really come together and give our ISSUP members access to the full range of opportunities to professionalize. As a global organization, ISSUP members are separated by distance. Therefore, one of our key channels is to facilitate that connection and professionalization online. And we have a website, newsletter, social media channels, and we're able to use them to deliver our mission. ISSUP Kenya is a local chapter and works to meet the needs of our members locally. We do so by hosting webinars that enable us to increase our reach, training, knowledge sharing, and networking opportunities. ISSUP is very grateful for the experts in the field that really enrich the content that we can provide to our members, such as today, where we are delighted to have Reverend Selvam of Don Bosco Youth Educational Services here in Nairobi, who will share insights from positive psychology and the psychology of religion as applied to treatment and recovery from addiction. Before I formally introduce him, a few housekeeping announcements. The webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available in a day or two on our issup.net website. A copy of the presentation slides will also be available there. Certificates of attendance will be emailed to all those that registered via the GoTo registration page with the email you used to register for the webinar. Please write in any questions you may have on the question box in your control panel. I'll collate them at the end and present them to Dr. Reverend Selvam at the end of the presentation. Please note that this webinar is provided for informational purposes only and does not constitute medical or treatment advice. The views presented here are those of the speaker and not necessarily those of ISSUP. Now, to introduce Reverend Dr. Selvam. Originally from India, he has been working in the academic and youth ministry contexts as a Catholic priest in East Africa since 1992. He has separate undergraduate degrees in philosophy, sociology, and religious studies, and master's degrees in philosophy and in psychology, specializing in the psychology of religion and positive psychology. He completed his PhD in psychology at the University of London in 2012. He has published over 30 peer-reviewed academic journal articles and book chapters, and written several books, including Pastoral Psychology for Africa, published in 2019. He is trained in narrative therapy, Ignatian spiritual accompaniment, and is a licensed user of the Griffiths 3 Early Childhood Assessment. Reverend Dr. Selvam is a registered member and senior supervisor at the Kenya Counselors and Psychologists Association. He is a founding chair of the Positive Psychology Association of Kenya. He runs character coach training programs with his team, forming character clubs in schools and youth centers in Kenya. He is also an associate Professor and Research Associate at Marist International University College, Nairobi. And so with that, I welcome you, Dr. Selva, to give us your presentation. Karibu.
Thank you, Albert, for your kind words and also linking me up with the International Society of Substance Use Professionals. It's really a privilege to be here. All right, I have 40 minutes, and so I get on with my presentation. Character strengths and recovery from addiction. So my presentation has 4 parts. In the first part, I would sort of present the background to the problem of the association or the relationship between or among addiction, spirituality, and character strengths. In the second part, very briefly, and a quick bird's eye view of character strengths as conceptualized within positive psychology. In the third part, then, how character strengths can become possible ingredients in facilitating recovery from addiction. There, I would use a little more empirical data. And in the fourth part, I would sample 4 character strengths and talk about very precise interventions that could be helpful in facilitating recovery from addiction, or at least maintaining recovery. So the first part, most sort of research and scientific inquiry, I think, begin with an experience of a Newtonian apple, a proverbial sort of an analogy. And my own Newtonian apple, as regards this area of my own research since 2008, began with a pastoral experience as a Catholic priest. I used to facilitate meditation and retreats, spiritual experiences for young people. And then I have young people visit me with stories of recovery from addiction, sex addiction, alcohol. So I said, what's happening here? So I see spiritual practices, especially contemplative practices, being associated with recovery from addiction. So I had an opportunity to do my PhD at the University of London, and I started exploring more this area of association between spirituality and addiction. Then in Jungian terms, you might call it synchronicity. I come across this book by Gerald May, Addiction and Grace. Well, he is a psychiatrist, but the book itself is not from a very scientific, empirical perspective, but a popular book. In any case, I said, let me study this a little more scientifically in my own way. And so I begin reading a little more scientific literature, and this is how I come across that addiction is more technical, and these are some of the definitions of addiction, and they are very nuanced. Then, of course, I rely on the 10 criteria. At that time, it was DSM-4, now DSM-5, with these 10 criteria for addiction. Increasing amount of access to what causes addiction, unsuccessful discontinuing, and I'm sure most of us are familiar with these 10 criteria. And of course, an immediate question that people ask when I say I'm in the domain of spirituality and addiction, people ask, can spirituality be an addiction? Now, if we look at the criteria in detail, addiction by definition contributes to harm in a person. So if a religious practice or a spiritual practice contributes to a negative impact in the individual and in his community, then yeah, it could be an addiction. Similarly, secondly, if the individual is trying to wanting to give away this spiritual practice, but they are not able, then it could be addiction. But most cases, I think it is a question of definition. And what is spirituality? There is a lot of literature. I myself have published a paper on the definition of spirituality and religion and how they interact. So finally, I would define spirituality as a way of fulfilling the need for transcendence, to go beyond, in terms of meaning, purpose, connectedness, compassion, from within a religion or outside it. Okay, so this is just to set also the platform for our discussion. Then a literature review on a standard database of academic literature way back in 2010 delivers or comes up with over 2,000 entries. You can see the search term, Boolean formula, addiction, and it's wide, as they call wildcard sort of a search using asterisks. These are the databases used, and then it challenges you. What new sort of an original work can I do if I want to qualify for a PhD entry? Now, by the way, the other day I repeated this search again on the same database, and now you can see from 2000 the entries have increased to 12,000. So it shows you the increase in the interest of research on this topic of the association between spirituality and addiction. Of course, addiction is defined, or in a very broad sense, different types of addiction, not just substance abuse, but also behavioral addiction. Okay, and then if this is a Boolean formula generated by OpenAI, more restricted conservative search gives us 3,000, over 3,000, nearly 4,000 entries. So it gives you an idea of what's happening in this field in research academically. So to summarize the findings in a very modest way, religiosity, that is defined as attendance of church worship or a religious worship, reading the religious scriptures, saying prayers, has been found to have some protective effect on addictive behavior. Protective effect. It can prevent. Whereas spirituality, as I defined it, and spirituality-based interventions sustain and maintain recovery. This is a very fair and modest, I think, conclusion to it. So coming back to my research, so as I have said, there is a lot of literature, and so a lot of reviews, systematic reviews, were pointing out at that time the gap in research. What is the underpinning mechanism in this relationship between spirituality and recovery from addiction? What are the mediators? So my hypothesis was that perhaps character strengths, as conceptualized within positive psychology, might have a role as a mediating role in the association between spirituality and recovery from addiction. So I narrowed down my literature review, focusing only on character strengths in the literature that talks about the association between spirituality and addiction. So these character strengths feature very highly. I carried out a qualitative systematic literature review, analyzing the discourse in these academic literature, and using in vivo, they could be sort of quantified. And you can see spirituality features high, kindness or compassion features next in its importance. Perspective is wisdom, okay, you can see. And then there are others like forgiveness, self-regulation. So that now takes us to the second part of my presentation in terms of the empirical data, more or less, emerging from my own studies. So, but my conceptualization, okay, before we go there, a little bit of conceptualization of character strengths within positive psychology. So what is positive psychology? Positive psychology is simply concerned with well-being and happiness. It is not positive thinking. It is not so-called Pollyanna attitude of smile and everything will be all right, but a scientific approach to well-being and happiness. There's a whole lot of literature available now, empirical academic literature on positive psychology, and that's not the scope of my presentation. So one of the ingredients of well-being and happiness as envisaged by positive psychology is character strengths, as a set of character strengths. There is also positive affect, sort of a subjective well-being, and there are also positive institutions that contribute to well-being, but our focus is on character strengths. There is this catalog of character strengths and virtues, which is now sort of a classical work within positive psychology in terms of conceptualizing character strengths. And what are character strengths? They are morally valued dispositions. They are trait-like. They are like personality traits because of repetition, because of habit, because basically virtue is a habit. And of course, when we come to addiction, we see addiction is also a habit. But character strengths yield positive results in terms of individual well-being and collective well-being. One, they have moral value. They have a moral connotation. So because of repetition, they become character-like. They become trait-like and almost like personality. And they are highly malleable. That means you can learn, unlearn. It's moldable in terms of individual thoughts, feelings, and actions. Well, here is a more descriptive characteristics listing of character strengths. They are trait-like, they are largely learned, a set of learned behavior. There could be some genetic influence, but there is also a lot of epigenetics in terms of the expression of the genes in a particular context and in terms of learning. And they are positive in content, they are malleable, that they can be unlearned, they can be molded, and they have a moral implication. So that is why we can praise or blame somebody. Praise somebody for the presence of a character and blame somebody for an absence of a character strength. Yeah, and it contributes to individual and collective well-being. So that is how positive psychology conceptualizes character strengths. Now, this is specific listing of the character strengths. You can see traditionally some of these character strengths or virtues used to be the subject of religions and cultural institutions. But what positive psychology has done is to take them from these religious and cultural institutions conceptualize them, operationalize them in terms of interventions, and empirically verify their impact. And our own focus here is what impact could these character strengths have on recovery from addiction. And if you are interested, you can take a free online assessment of your own character strengths, what is called the Values in Action Survey, VR, okay, Values in Action, which will then rank your character strengths. Okay, so that is in brief, sort of a broad brush introduction to character strengths. Now, character strengths and addiction based on my PhD project and some empirical data. Now, what you see is a sort of an outcome or an output from a path analysis with basically data drawn from over 500 participants. Data was collected in Nairobi among university students aged between 18 and 35. Now, what this says is you see some salient character strengths on the left side of the screen, and you see alcohol misuse and sex addiction on the right side of the screen. And in between, you have some moderating or mediating variables. Coping, so the ACT cope is one type of coping, and anxiety. So you can see one of the surprising things that consistently features in the data that is emerging from the study of the relationship between spirituality and character strengths is forgiveness. And of course, spirituality. So what this says is a lack of forgiveness predicts sex addiction. And that could be explained by the mediating role of anxiety. That lack of forgiveness might contribute to increase in anxiety, and increase in anxiety positively is correlated to sex addiction. Similarly, spirituality, lack of spirituality predicts or has a negative relationship to alcoholic misuse, lack of prudence, again, lack of integrity to sex addiction. Okay, so this is basically a little bit of a more rigorous analysis from the correlational analysis. Then I did an intervention. I selected 25 people, okay, and took them through a 10 weeks intervention of teaching them. I didn't do it. For sake of sort of a scientific character of the intervention, I had 2 people follow up this group of 25 participants who had scored high beyond the cutoff points on sex addiction and alcoholic abuse or misuse. And they were taken through 10 weeks of Christian contemplative practice. In the Christian tradition, there are different contemplative practices, what secular world calls mindfulness. So I used a method called Jesus prayer, basically that is used among the Orthodox churches. And every day they were invited to practice it for 20 minutes. And it consists in just repeating within oneself, being aware as they breathe in, Jesus, Son of the living God, and as they breathe out, have mercy on me. And they were given prayer beats for focus, and it's mindfulness. It's basically, the difference is there is a Christian content to this mindfulness. Then I interviewed 10 people, and also 10 people shared their journals with ethical clearance and all that. So now let me focus on 2 people who were very interesting cases in terms of extreme sort of difference before and after the intervention. let us just call them Martin and Idel. So Martin, you can see he scored low on appreciation of beauty, love for learning, perspective, persistence, self-regulation. You can see between the two, self-regulation seems to feature as common elements. And then in Idel, there is also forgiveness and spirituality. Okay, so after the intervention in the qualitative data, I also had the quantitative data, but because the numbers were small, statistical significance could not be achieved. But the qualitative data showed sort of an interaction of character strengths. And I also began to see certain pattern in it. Okay, self-awareness, humility, relating to spirituality, and self-awareness also leading one to responsibility in the case of Martin. In the case of Idel, again, spirituality features, self-regulation features, and forgiveness, okay, and social intelligence. So in summary, what was happening was there is a set of character strengths that relate to the self, like humility, self-control, or self-regulation. So there is an inward journey towards the self. There is an upward journey towards whatever people call a supernatural power, God, in terms of spirituality. And there is an outward journey, okay, towards others and rest of creation in terms of compassion, forgiveness, reconciliation. Okay, so this was an interesting pattern. Okay, so this was a brief sort of a presentation of the relationship between character strengths and its role in assisting recovery from addiction. As you can see, there's a whole lot of data. This is my own sort of data that I have presented, also due to lack of time. Now, finally, the last part, I sample 4 character strengths and take you through possible interventions and how they might be relevant for addiction recovery or maintaining recovery. So the first consistent intervention that appears in a whole lot of literature is mindfulness. Mindfulness is a secular term for what I call contemplation. Though mindfulness comes from a Buddhist tradition, it has been secularized because also I think Buddhism lends itself for such a possibility. And it gives a safe space for people who are also operating from outside religion to practice meditation. So mindfulness is just paying attention in a particular way, focused at the present moment in a non-judgmental way. How it differs from a Christian contemplative practice is that in the Christian contemplative practice, there is a content to it, that there is a clear focus on a personal God. Okay, so what would be the relevance of mindfulness in assisting or facilitating recovery from addiction? First of all, the very fact that somebody sits down, I think brings about a certain level of discipline, what in positive psychology, in terms of character strengths, excuse me, we call self-regulation or self-control. Now, as the person sits down in mindfulness practice, they also feel connected to the rest of humanity. And therefore, it opens up a whole set of affective processes in terms of compassion and empathy. And that's also related to forgiveness and reconciliation. As William James called, they begin to see, there is a breakup of the selfhood. They begin to see themselves in that altered consciousness as part of something larger than themselves. We can call it humanity and a supernatural power. So, and I suppose that these elements contribute to recovery from addiction, and you can look at literature. The second set of interventions related to character strengths would be random acts of kindness. What are they? Just compassionate practices. Now, why are they called random acts of kindness? Because there's certain spontaneity about them. They are not really planned. They come spontaneously, that I reach out to someone in need in different ways. And secondly, it can also be to strangers. So research suggests that acts of kindness carried out or done to strangers have more impact on the individual in terms of their well-being and happiness. And so what could be happening here in relation to recovery from addiction? Addiction is marked by a certain self-obsession. There's a whole lot of inward-looking processes in addiction. So I suppose random acts of kindness opens up the person towards something beyond themselves. And that breaks up an ego boundary in terms of engaging in social support. And even the Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12 steps that I'll keep referring to in the next few slides, talks about social support as a way of maintaining recovery. So there is a whole lot of, I think, interactions that are going on here in terms of how the random acts of kindness or kindness as a character strength could be in play in assisting recovery from addiction. Thirdly, forgiveness and recovery, as I have shown in my own data very quickly, forgiveness and recovery seems to be related to addiction, particularly in literature of the association between spirituality and addiction. So forgiveness itself can be conceptualized at 3 levels. Forgiveness of the self. A person who is addicted definitely feels guilty about it, and that guilt itself could push them back to a trap of going back to their addictive behavior or substance. Secondly, forgiveness from others, because forgiveness has also a social impact in the immediate family, in their social circles, at the workplace, and therefore in terms of forgiveness and recovery, there is a need for the individual to seek forgiveness. Thirdly, forgiveness from a greater power, and this is envisaged on in the 5th step of the 12 steps of the Alcoholics Anonymous. Forgiveness now, intervention within positive psychology. There is a lot of literature on the conceptualization and operationalization of forgiveness and reconciliation within positive psychology. For example, Enright and Coyle, they see forgiveness as not simply saying, okay, I forgive, but recognizing the actual injustice, owning up the hurt that I might have gone through. Then it's a choice that I make. It's an act of will that now I let go of the justifiable retribution or wanting revenge. And that is forgiveness. And then I'm open to a relationship in reconciliation. But if not, at least I begin to treat the other person as a fellow human being, even if I'm not able to establish the relationship. So there's a whole lot of conceptualization around this forgiveness, that forgiveness does not necessarily mean forgetting. It does not entail necessarily reconciliation, and a whole lot of stuff. And sometimes forgiveness also entails seeking justice. So this is one of the interventions that I use with my own clients. So by the way, I should have said this in the beginning, that we are not claiming that in very hardcore substance-based addictive behavior, that straight away spirituality is going to help. Not at all. I want to be clear about that. Sometimes medical intervention is needed, but as I said in one of my slides, these things can prevent from getting into addiction and more support the maintenance process from in recovery state. Okay, so what this forgiveness litany consists in is an individual getting into a spirit of contemplation, choosing a hurtful experience, and then writing a sort of a journal around these steps, owning up the hurt and then deciding to let go of it. Okay, so finally, purpose in life. In positive psychology, purpose in life would be associated with future orientation and hope. And positive psychology defines purpose as the desire to achieve something beyond the self. And it's also associated with the 11th and the 12th steps in Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12-step process. And one of the most influential texts in positive psychology is from William Damon, also Steger, and they suggest that people are happy, they enjoy better well-being if they have a clear purpose in life, and if this purpose is focused on others. And so in terms of an intervention, we could facilitate somebody to come up with a personal mission statement that simply consists in bringing together a statement on how they would bring together their talents and gifts, their skills and knowledge, their desires and passion, and their perception of the world and its needs in terms of what they are called to be in this world and what they are called to do. So what I've done is a broad brush, sort of a very quick mention of certain interventions in eliciting more interest among you in the topic on positive psychology and particularly character strengths and recovery from addiction. So thank you very much, and I hope I have kept time, maybe even a little bit ahead, and I think that will give us more time for question and answer. Over to you, Albert.
Wow. Reverend Selvon, thank you so much for that really insightful presentation. I think it opens up a whole area of inquiry, as you've noted. It's an increasingly popular topic, character strengths and positive psychology with respect to addictions. And before I go to the questions on the panel, I had one myself, and I wondered, when it comes to character strengths and behavior change, what is the agent of change? You've introduced to us what character strengths are, but what is it that shifts somebody from one position to another?
Oh, well, there is surely a play of free will, a role of free will of the individual, that they make a choice to take on a set of positive habits, habits related to a particular character strengths, that these habits become virtue because they have a positive impact on the individual and their community around. And then it becomes trait-like. So in terms of, if you want to talk about an agent or in terms of mechanism, I think there is an act of will that is involved and a repetitive behavior, which is basically positive in its content and its outcome.
Okay, so the behavior becomes ingrained by virtue of repetition.
Yeah. Yeah.
In addiction language, we speak about recovery being abstinence plus positive change. So in this context of positive psychology and character strengths, then the positive change is what is comprised of the character strengths.
Yeah, that's a very interesting connection. Yeah, yeah. And both are habits. Addiction is
Yes.
also a set of, so we are replacing a set of negative habits that has a negative impact and outcome on the individual and the community around with a set of positive habits. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. We have that same idea in motivational interviewing, where you can talk about the motivation to engage in or enter into addiction, and then the motivation to get out and get into sustained recovery. Both directions, motivation is involved. So,
Yeah.
is there a counterpart to a negative counterpart to character strengths? I suppose those are what you call vices.
Yeah, what you call motivation is what I called an act of free will.
Mm.
And that is why in the definition of character strengths, we said that it has a moral content, moral implication. So it has a moral content because it involves a free will of the individual. So we are presupposing a sort of a philosophical background to this. That it is coming from a humanistic psychology perspective, but where positive psychology contributes is to empirically verify that. Yeah. So yes, humanistic psychology would talk about motivation, that we are not simply victims of the unconscious and learned behavior, but we can modify our behavior because of our motivation and what I called an act of free will, and because it has a moral content.
Then you have directed us to where we can learn or discover what our own individual character strengths are. What do we do once we have discovered them? How can we, what do we do?
Yeah. So what positive psychology does is once you assess your own character strengths in terms of well-developed character strengths and less developed character strengths, then there are interventions around how you might invest on your positive, well-developed character strengths, and you may grow in your underdeveloped character strengths by specific interventions. Let us say I didn't talk about gratitude here. Gratitude is a very simple example how you might grow in gratitude, because gratitude increases positivity. Positivity helps us to see possibilities even when there is depression and anxiety and stress. So one intervention around positive of gratitude is keeping a gratitude journaling, doing gratitude journaling. Say 3 things that went well for you at the end of every day for that day. So that is how you grow in your least developed character strengths.
Okay, so one can deliberately find ways of growing and developing whatever particular strength they want to develop.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And in the case of our discussion, I was just selecting 4 of the character strengths, which may be relevant in assisting recovery from addiction and maintaining recovery.
Because I was going to ask, you mentioned that there are 24 that have been researched.
Yeah.
Would you say that those 4 that you talked about are the ones that, in your view, are the most would give the most mileage in terms of recovery, are the most beneficial to somebody recovering from addiction? Or would any of the 24
My choice
apply?
was rather random. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, my choice was rather random, but based on literature and my own personal experience of assisting people in a therapeutic context. Yeah, but it would be interesting to explore each of those character strengths and see if they are relevant or not. One caveat that I would like to make is at least my data suggests that, for example, curiosity is listed as one of the character strengths by positive psychology. And I tend to think curiosity, when combined with, sort of a personality trait of novelty seeking, could be a trigger for addictive behavior as well. So yes, I have had discussions with my colleagues in positive psychology about the possible role of curiosity. I think there is a curiosity that does not what do you call cause harm. Yeah, it can be also termed as love for learning. So all those stuff are there.
Okay, great. Then I'll go to one last observation then, because I'm involved in treatment as an addiction counselor, and one of the things we employ are coping skills, because many people who get into addiction, usually because they got into it at a fairly young age, the adolescence was interrupted by addictive behaviors, haven't fully developed coping skills. And so that is one area that they need to work on. From my understanding, would character strengths then comprise these coping skills?
Yeah, in one of my slides, if you remember, I mentioned the association between, for example, spirituality and coping, which then is the increase in coping decreases the possibility of addictive behavior. Yeah, and there are different, as you know, there are different types of coping styles. Some are functional, some are dysfunctional, or adaptive or maladaptive, whatever terms you use. And I suppose ACT coping is a positive choice that people make in terms of making positive decisions in coping with the situation. And that is what was associated with spirituality. And spirituality is a character strength also among the list of 24 character strengths in positive psychology.
Okay, okay. I'm sure there's so much more to learn on this. We have a question from somebody here who's asking, school students are big in number, both in substance use disorder and behavior addictions. What would be a way forward for them in terms of character strengths or character strengthening? I suppose he's looking specifically at that population.
In terms of collective intervention and preventive intervention, very early on, character strengths, mindfulness practices are increasingly being offered in the school context. Like my own work currently, together with my colleagues in Positive Psychology Association of Kenya, is we have developed manuals in facilitating interventions around character strengths in the school context. So if we start early, we can also prevent. But at least, as a Catholic priest belonging to the Salesians of Don Bosco, we work with youth, particularly in the educational context. And I say, with youth work and working with children, we need to offer them that morning afterthought. Let's say somebody had recourse to substance. The next day when they wake up, are they able to say, what have I landed myself in? Now, character strengths has, the interventions around character strengths have the potential to facilitate that type of coming back to recovery quickly, Secondly, if these addictive behavior is related to relationships, stress, sort of even genetic sort of dispositions like ADHD, depression, then I think character strengths interventions can mitigate to break that confounding factors. Yeah, there's a lot of literature around that. Yeah, it would be interesting to look up at mindfulness practice and ADHD, because we know ADHD is a predictor for addictive behavior. And I think character strengths interventions can regulate some of these predispositions as well.
Wow. So character coaching is a way of teaching people how to embrace character strengths?
Yeah, it's a term that we have invented in our Association of Positive Psychology in Kenya, that we are trying to create a profession around it. That just as there are life coaches and sports coaches, can we have character coaches who are trained, who are also people of character, who are able to coach young people, other people in character development? That is a background.
How would that be similar or different from enhancing coping skills?
Definitely, it is related. It's not different, and therefore, a person like you who is in the addiction space, facilitating recovery, you could train yourself as a character coach and see how you can integrate interventions around character strengths to facilitate recovery. Yeah. So that would be the connection.
Yeah, I think I'll follow you up on that. I see a real possible benefit. Yeah, so I have another question here. It sounds like character strengths are from moral theories of addiction. How do we bring in the convergence of addiction in the brain? As I'm sure you are aware, that's a big...
in terms of the neurobiological framework,
yes.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a very intriguing question. Yes, I've done a little bit of reading around neurobiological process of addiction, the dopamine activity and all that, allostasis and all those processes. It would be interesting to look at literature. At the moment, I am not able to look at, tell you exactly how the connection would be, but definitely there is literature around neurobiology of character strengths, and we have neurobiology of addiction. It would be interesting to look at the relationship between the two sets of literature. Yeah, and definitely I think, for example, mindfulness regulates dopamine activity, and mindfulness develops prefrontal cortex in terms of the brain structure, and prefrontal cortex is responsible for rational choices. So yes, definitely there are these connections. I'm a bit arbitrary about it, but definitely I see the point there.
Yeah, that would be a wonderful follow-up topic to this. I have a question here which you may have answered, but let me ask it. The questioner is saying they can see how character strengths apply to addiction prevention, as you have just said. They're asking how they apply to treatment of addiction in particular, which I think is what we were referring to in terms of recovery plus positive change. Would you want to say anything more about that?
There is a project called Project Match in the US with regard to assisting people in the recovery process. One method does not fit all. Secondly, there needs to be a combination of interventions. So some people in acute cases of addiction, substance-based addiction, and even alcohol misuse, they will definitely need medical intervention. But together with medical intervention, we need to offer them social support. We need to offer them alternatives of changing their behavior, lifestyle. So that is where character strengths will come in. So I would not, even as an advocate of character strengths for well-being and happiness, I would not be unscientific in terms of claiming that character strengths will solve all problems. So we need to match and we need to combine interventions. That would be a fair sort of a position.
Yeah, we take the biopsychosocial spiritual framework for addiction, and certainly there's a physical element which is pharmacological, and it has its interventions, but ultimately how you treat addiction is a function of how you define it. And to the extent that addiction has a behavioral component, then clearly character strengths and positive psychology has a role there. And I also find, again, as a practitioner, that addiction leaves a void in somebody's life. And in a way, the addictive behavior is an attempt to fill that void. It may have created it in the first place, but they use it to try and fill it. And I found that the idea of positive psychology as a filler for that void is very compelling.
Yeah, that's a wonderful summary.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I think with that we'll stop there. And I really do want to thank you, Reverend Selvum. I just sense that we will do this again, as there's some clear areas you've mentioned that require a bit more research and investigation. And the questions that are coming through are also quite engaging, and they're coming literally from all over the world. So this is an area that I believe we will revisit. So on behalf of ISSUP Kenya, and indeed the ISSUP global family, I really do want to thank you for your participation, for your facilitation, for your insights, and for your wisdom. And I really do pray that we will be able to do this again, especially on the issue of character coaching. I'd like to hear more about that. And so on behalf of ISSUP Kenya and the Executive Committee, the President of ISSUP Kenya, the Executive Committee members, and ISSUP Kenya as a whole, we do want to thank ISSUP Global for facilitating this. They have been so gracious as always. And we want to thank the audience for participation wherever you come from. As I said at the beginning, you'll receive a certificate of attendance. This webinar, and I believe with your permission, Reverend Selvum, the slides as well, will be available from issup.net in a day or two. And we look out for more announcements for further webinars. We do hope to have one next month, and you'll be hearing the announcement about that. So on behalf of ISSUP Kenya, I do want to thank you all. I bid you a good night and God bless you. And thank you, Reverend Selvum.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Good night.